Finding a character in motion is about bringing my own life into its own game. It's troubling to say so much is for the least. I don't like the fact that it's just becoming. This illusion of what I can bring about is more or less faceted by understanding. It's in ruination. Complicated matter like this is joking just to say that you don't like it. It's for my own sake, I will just say that I practice it into its own lesson. After all, it's moving into something that I can't just go on about saying. It's directly into its own involvement. It's about protesting and then saying what you protested about, how it moves you into your own lanes, how some of these things are just not the same thing as cold or thinking. They are about understanding. And what we understand is more or less created by us. We confront it as it is. We say it for what it is, and then we move into it, not understanding why we didn't really complicate these things for us. It's about joining into habitations and realizing that the distraction of it is by fault an interesting picture. It's about moving, going on about taking part of what's wanted and then removing the rest because it's the whole journey that's important, and saving is not the picture. It's happening in the moment, and I feel like that moment is important and some moments are missed. Like any drawn picture, you might involve yourself into realizing that you were discussing things because they were interesting to you, and then when you didn't stop to think about them and realize that that facet of your understanding was complicated to yourself, you made yourself seem smaller. By that definition, you didn't kind of come out of your own shell. Now, the shelling and coming out of it is part of what's important, and we all have different ways of realizing what we can do and what we like, and that's going to be a basic understanding of us. How some of us might be more fitting into joking of our own kindness and then dissolving that into our own protesting way of realizing what's figured speech and what's not. Nothing can be said about these things other than to join. And when we join them, we might just realize that it's about taking it into its own part. And then those parts are going to be the best parts that you will find. It's about motivating yourself too, not knowing how complicated it is to motivate oneself is because there's so many different ways of motivation, and you might want to find a way that works for you. Now, that doesn't say much about motivation. It just says that there's so many ways, and what works for you might not actually be the best thing in for you as well, because you might have limited understanding when it comes to that. So you complicate the matters and use them to free yourself and communicate with the world around you about what is good and what is less so good. Now, what did you understand by the part of your beginning in your journey where you just started out realizing that there is probably some magic to what can be done and dealt with around you into the space? You felt that there might have been more motions of understanding that might have been okay. So we can come to conclusive thought because of this. We realize that there is facets of ourselves that are just more joyful, so much more than the ones that begun. They protect us because they are part of us. They flow, and we realize that by the flowing motions of those, we can kind of come to some kind of joining of senses where we say these things are involved in each other, and their involvement in each other is what makes, because it can be said about it, you can take hold of it, and you can realize that moving these spaces into some things that we might align with, some things that we might feel are better for us, is jumping into conclusions of no mind. Now, not to think about this, not to think about this too much. It's to follow onto it and slip into realizing conditions of what is good and what is not. I joined this by that direction. I move into it by knowing that for one sake, I might like some of it a bit more than other. And I think that that is becoming of me to do so, to want to realize that distractions can be made and assured about, but we might feel that there might be a little bit less to listen to when we come to understand why. We're involved in leaving our own useful attractions into a designated spot, and these designated spots are going to be mostly used for a far longer time than we might be thinking about at first. It's part of joining and then realizing that by joining we can come to some kind of fruition of what is good and what is not so good. No more can be said about them before we realize that we didn't pretend. So for no sake than our own, do we do these little chapters. They move and they bring about joining. It's less convoluted by following it into its own traction and taking space to move it into its own positions. I say that the further along I go with these things, makes me realize that I'm more inclined to join some of them because of the matters that they might pretend to speak of. A place of reaction, not hiding too much of the psychedelic truths away from us. They're bound to be part of a space, a general relative space that we're all involved in. Now, how do we compare these to others? We can come to some kind of conclusions that there are things about the psychedelic renaissance that we're all involved in that may seem rigid in its own sense, but I conclude that it isn't. There are more and more characters being involved in it by the year. So joining in this direction, I feel there must be much more said in the priesthoodness of this, of confessions, coming into attitudes by understanding that such is done by the ones of us that are involved in them. such is moved into and understood. We face life in similar matter. We face them because they change us. We flow into what it is. Now, does that change me at all? Or do I simply realize how I can come to being? I want this change to be part of what I disappear into, part of what I move into. These wishes of mine, they're to some understanding good, not withhold, trying by default of it. I think it is more of an issue to resolve some understanding. Undiluting pain is distracting. It's part of my givings. So much could be said. It happens that way. And never mind that I didn't take it for granted. I just understood that it was for its own sake. So much could have been done before it was introduced later by not knowing why there is a nature involved into our own positions. We can come to conflicting results by default by not holding on to some useful thought and going into reasons why it is more or less said that way, because there is attentiveness to it. Feeling of joy can be given in sorrow too. It is more or less my mistakes, so much of the involvement into it. It's by default, I don't think it just gives me a joyful reason. I Here it is here to stay, and there is more notions of that too. By the wayside, it happens probably less problematic as intended than what was less intended too. I felt that those mistakes could have been dissolved by coming to some kind of protection of, wow, this is good and this is less so. But you wouldn't think that by not knowing where you could have been. How to come to a journey's part is to take hold of it and see what other people that are involved in listening into these stories can share about them. And they might find that the reasons are less to follow, and some might find more reasons to follow than others. So to think too much of that, it kind of takes you away from the mold that you're molding of yourself into being. Hold it and realize that there are discussions to be made, some better than others, and some from other cultures, and that will always be a difference in life. To now realize that where we come from, how we speak because of it, is a situation that makes us more involved, more comparative to the whole situation of life than what might have been understood at first. So, foremost, we might change our attitude about this and bringing it into a place where we can find it to be cool to join into it. It's alright in its sense. It needs to say, stick it, finding joy with it and moving back to it is just so much more structured, so much more vivid in its own intendedness. It's by thinking that I would follow into reasons where I think that there is a place for me, and then those places would be obviously contended with too. I would nurture it by fault, by default. I would nurture it by default. To proclaim it to be less so is not to say that I understood. No, I think that there is reasons to join into this kind of a category because there is less obvious befuddlement with it than to not join. So bring it about the character, bringing it about. I would title this Bringing About Your Own Character, and how to do so by continuing on this journey. It is important to characterize that willfulness takes us just so far. It is part of who we are, the willfulness, it is part of what we become. And the more that we do things together, the more that we realize that the doing of things together is good in its own sense, should allow us to understand that we can come to conclusions of what is better than other things. Finding that you need to take time and space to use your own tools to follow into what reason could be found here without giving it any time. No more can be said. It's just the same. I find it to be so. Simpler things could be heard about it, but then you wouldn't really realize that there were thinking being involved at all, would you? No. You would discuss this with yourself, and then you wouldn't really find it out to be a good thing for you. No. You would just move it because there was so much more said than done. And then that was the easy way out. And what's wrong about the easy way out? I would take the easy way out if I could, most of the time. If I took anything else, it's because I didn't understand it. And now understanding it is changing me, myself not realizing who I am. And that's becoming part of the problem of any figment of imagination that I could hold on to this with. It's just because I wouldn't really follow my own lines. If I did something like that, did I know? No, I just considered. No more could be said because attitudes were just led here. They just faltered before they understood what they were. So they didn't really perceive themselves enough. They simply said that they were protective matters that could be taken with it. And I flowed with that, and I internalized that it was good in its own sense. But however good it was, it didn't really joke to be felt or anything like that. It just made its own interest by moving and then realizing that some of these things were good. Others were just not as good. They were different. They made things seem to be less formatted than other things could have been said. I do think that the Renaissance here is basic. Like, our feelings of it at first, all of us, were to join and kind of come to these conclusions. If you check the notices on Arrowhead, you might find out that there are beginnings that we can recognize and then say that, okay, we did these kind of things together, and then we took our own path with it. But after a while, we might understand that It wasn't really just enough, it was part of who we were. And the characterizations of it was basically the best thing we could have done. We moved it to be so. I think there are facets of this that are better said than left. Things, things that are more joined by us knowing that we can look back at this and then realize that, oh, okay, we come to some kind of understanding by involving ourselves in it, and then less understanding to not involve ourselves in it, but by using it for what it is. It has its own protected feelings. You might change for the matter, and that might be good. But if you don't change, if you don't really have any reasons to be one of the people that talk about these kind of things or actually come to some kind of conclusions of what it is, then it might be because you didn't really take your time, they didn't take your hold or your feelings involvement with it. You just protected what could have been good for it, and that is what it was. It was good because of the sense of what is good could have been, and nothing else was actually said. So much more could have been given by the feelings of practice. Not that we didn't just take it for granted. No, many of us did, I would say. Many of us did actually take it for granted. Taking a psychedelic for granted is not why I want you to use it. Why I want you to use it is to actually understand that it comes with some pains, good pains and bad pains. But pains, as in you will feel your body move with it, you will actually react to it. Borrowing from this, from other people's understanding of it too. It's simple to think that we're involved in this because we are the ones that are in the forefront, that we're some kind of subject to magnanimous understanding of the world can come to mind when I say these things. Wherever it was involved was because it was protected by our childish sense of worldliness, how the world is supposed to look like. Let's say, come to these conclusions, and you might just withhold yourself into some part of understanding that you didn't really realize that you had. No more about beginning or taking hold of thinking or anything like that. It's just my mind against my mind in matters. And that is good if you think about it in a game sense. Like if you would have been a player person that would have played a player versus player game, that's two different players. Well, let's say the second player is you, and you can only win in that sense. It's not always in the sense of my mind versus my mind, that's in a destructive sense. Here it's in a creative sense. You are fighting your own mind, but you're fighting your mind to create more. So no matter which side of the mind wins, let's say, you would win still because it's you. But it seems real, very real, and it's kind of be frightening in that sense because you find yourself to be fighting for your life at times. At least the feelings are very much similar to one who would be fighting for your life. If you've ever been in any real danger, you might be able to directly see the similarities. As I've had been in real danger a couple of times before, and I can say that those real dangers actually seem smaller than many of these mind versus mind actions that I would be placed in. So witness that and figure it out. Take it for what it is. It's about time that you may protect your sense of wonder this way too. I feel that it's sacrosanct in some ways too. I feel that a lot of other explorers would say it the same way too. They would say it's sacrosanct in some ways because they have mystical, of what they call experiences of spiritual matter. And to, not to delve too deeply into that because it's kind of hard to do it in just colloquial language. But the fact that these mystical experiences are being had can be seen in a very sacrosanct way, which comes back to the fact that you shouldn't disregard the experiences you're having and taking them for granted by feeling that just by having experience it is enough. Sometimes the processing of the experience, actually taking in and understanding the experience by doing actions to come to understand the experience are what's important. So if someone here is new, a beginner into psychedelics, uh, I would say take your experiences and actually put them into documentation. Do document your experiences afterwards or during too, if you could. No, that's not as important, but afterwards is quite important to after experiences to document them and to be able to look back at your documentation and say to yourself like, oh yes, this is what that was, and this is what this is. These new feelings that you have been given since the experience, the last experience that is. And every experience is kind of different in some ways, but they have very many similarities. That's why we can call them psychedelic experiences. Be a witness to yourself. That is part of the feeling, being a witness to oneself. To allow oneself to actually go and give yourself these attitudes that you're looking forward to. And knowing that by giving them some room, it's better for you. Why? Why is it better? Well, it's less restricted. Sometimes taking the back seat to just be able to view everything going on in motion will give you occurrences of understanding. Not to mean that you should leave the front seat completely open forever. No, it's about the changing of the back seat and the front seat. That is the ability of this. Knowing so. There's not much legend to this yet. We still find that we come to these grand stories that are seemingly legendary. There's not much legend to this because we usually don't allow the experiences to continue. Some of us do, and some experiences will continue no matter what. But not doing anything about them, going back into normal consciousness, is part of the reason why there's not much legend to this. Not building a story of it, taking it with you, and then actually motioning it to be steadfast in continuation is part of the reason why there's not much legend to this. So find joy and bring it about into fruition, and then think about it, and then reason it out as, oh, this could be good and this could be something else of other matter. You think about it a lot, and then you might realize that, okay, these things are special because they are flowing and they have attitudes of their own. Normal conclusiveness can be said about them, then take your own time with it. And if you don't take your own time with it, then you might actually realize that such things weren't really understood well. And it's understanding of it that's quite important here. Now, how do you find that understanding? Well, you find it by doing it, by actually trying to make something out of it. And that could take you a while, longer while than you might be used to, but it's still a while. And that sensibility of, okay, a while is something that I can relate to and something that I can actually direct into a happening of my own is what's important here. So wonder and take your hold. Moving images. There's a lot of moving images in experience of this matter. Many, many things are changing, revolving around you. And that doesn't really stop. It just doesn't look the same when you're in a waking reality, a waking normal conscious reality. You might not find that things are changing, but if you look at your own movements, if you look at your own movements, you might find that you're still looking at them, just that your mind separated from your motions. So your mind observing your emotions is still, while the emotions are still very acting in the sense that they're all still moving and then figuring things out that were seen before and trying to see similarities by here I'm guessing instead of coming to the instead of coming to the conclusion of what it is yet, because at this time it's something that I'm still processing. There's this otherness to yourself after being still for a while. This otherness, and this otherness comes to become its own character. Bringing some kind of understanding between you and this otherness, this other character of you, where your mind is still, it is no mind at all. So it allows you to see more outside. Now, this outside other character, it still reacts as if it is you, and in many ways it is you. If you would, but it's a very personal, very egoistic you. Egotistic you. So we're involved. By definition, we are involved into this egotistic self, this otherness. It's by the comparison of it and your still mind that you can come to witness that it is you in its actions and its joy and its freedom to just behave in any way. But being able to be reigned by a super ego is also possible. But that's also something that seems to be happening by itself and not, and something that you can witness in its own occurrences. So the stillness is found in the psychedelic experiences too. If you ever try to meditate on psychedelics, you might realize that, or if you try to do yoga, standing meditation, moving meditation, you might come to realize that too. You might experience it for yourself, how you witness your own body kind of flowing very much like a character. It's best to say the character in some very animated game, so to say, or animated TV show. It seems to almost breathe by itself where your breath is still. Not that your breath stopped, it's just still, as in it has its own control over the body, but it's very connected to it. It's not restricted because it might seem so. It might seem restricted to you, that it wants to go away, or that it could have if it had the chances to, or the ability to more. But it is not so. It is you. It's just the you that is not thinking, the you that is acting, or the you that is wandering, or the you that is asking but not really thinking. No, the thinking mind is still too. You can contemplate but not think. It seems very much more naturalistic in that sense. And by being still, it's easily found. Other than that, you cannot really differentiate yourself with it. It seems so interpersonal. However, mind that your feelings are good and that there's a continuation, that you haven't lost yourself. There's no such sense of dislocation in your mind. You're not in a disarray. You're very still. And that's very important because the stillness kind of shows that at any point you can come to action. And even when you're not coming to action, you are in action. Not that you're just part of time or part of the timeline that we're all in because it's always moving forward as time is. No, that you as a breathing character are breathing along and making your own little noise of the world, your own little creative outlets of the world, even when you're not paying attention to it. This gives us room to relinquish any kind of extortions. It gives us room to relinquish any kind of extortions of wanting to take these into actions, wanting to take hold of these thoughts of us not being enough, for example.